There's a moment that comes after we start questioning the way we were taught to understand God, and it's quieter than doubt. It's the moment where trust starts to feel risky, not because we don't want to trust God, but because we're not sure what that trust might cost us. For a lot of us, faith didn't fall apart because we stopped believing. It fell apart because surrender stopped feeling safe. We often talk about prayer as if it's meant to be measured by outcomes, whether something changes, whether the answer comes, whether the situation improves. And when prayer stops working the way that we were taught that it should, a deeper question shows up. If prayer isn't a way to control outcomes, then what am I actually trusting God with? Many of us were taught to trust God, but we were also taught to be careful with Him. Careful what we ask, careful how honest we are, careful not to disappoint Him. God was good, but God was also unpredictable. He was loving, but also easily angered, close enough to demand obedience, but distant enough to feel dangerous. And when that's the version of God you've been given, trust doesn't feel like rest. It feels like risk management. So maybe the question isn't whether God is asking too much of us. Maybe the question is whether the version of God we've been trusting was ever safe to begin with. What if God is safer than we think? One of the reasons that trust feels so complicated is because many of us were taught that the Bible is a collection of lessons about obedience, not as a story about who God is. We learned what God expects long before we learned what God is like. But when you step back and look at the story that Scripture is actually telling, something different begins to come into focus. Over and over again, the Bible doesn't start with commands. It starts with character. Faith in the Bible story is never blind. Scripture describes faith as confidence in what we hope for and trust in what we cannot yet see. Not because God is unknown, but because the future is unknown to us, even though it's not unknown to Him. Biblical faith isn't about believing without reason. It's about trusting God's character before the outcome comes into view. God consistently reveals His name, His ways, His posture towards humanity before asking anyone to follow Him. Trust is invited, not coerced. This is where the story the Bible is telling becomes impossible to miss. Because if God wanted to be trusted, He didn't just give instructions. He gave Himself in Jesus. God doesn't explain His character from a distance. He shows it. Jesus doesn't arrive as a new version of God. He arrives as the clearest picture of who God always has been. Instead of demanding trust through power, Jesus invites trust through presence. He moves towards the people who are afraid, the people who are uncertain, the people who don't get it right, and instead of punishing them for their hesitation, He stays. If God's power were meant to make us afraid, Jesus would have used it very differently. But Jesus doesn't coerce. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't rush people into faith faster than they're ready for. He listens. He touches. He waits. Again and again, Jesus uses power not to protect Himself, but to restore others. People trusted Jesus not because they understood everything, but because they felt safe enough to stay near Him. They asked questions. They doubted. They misunderstood Him constantly. And He never treated those things as disqualifiers. That's not accidental. That's revelatory. If Jesus is the clearest picture of God we have, then whatever is true of Jesus tells us something true about God, which means God's character is not revealed through unpredictability or fear or silent distance. It's revealed through presence, patience, and self-giving love. And even with Jesus, even when we can see God's character more clearly, trust doesn't suddenly become easy. For some people, knowing who God is doesn't immediately erase what trusting Him has cost them before. There are prayers that were prayed sincerely and still went unanswered. Losses that happened anyway. Trust that was offered and felt like it led to disappointment. And if trusting God has ever felt complicated for you because of that, it doesn't mean you failed at faith. It simply means that you learned to trust in a context where safety was assumed, but never actually established. Jesus doesn't ignore that hesitation. He meets people inside it. He doesn't shame slow trust. He invites it. So maybe this question isn't asking you to trust God more. Maybe it's inviting you to trust God differently. Not faster, not louder, not with fewer questions, but with honesty. If God is revealed most clearly in Jesus, then trust doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with presence, with staying close enough to notice what God is actually like. And maybe that's where faith grows best. Not in bravery, but in the slow discovery that God is not in a hurry to harm you. So what if God is safer than we think? If this topic stirred something more in you and you want to learn more or see more about what Scripture has to say on this topic, I've linked further reading in the description below.